Hello BookTube, this is part 13 of my 2022 library tour. Today I'll be beginning the history shelves of the library tour. I'm beginning with this shelf up here. So let's get started. This is Gay Life and Culture, a World History, edited by Robert Aldrich. This is an basically this is an anthology of historical essays that cover or give overviews of gay history, primarily focusing on European history with other continents getting essay overviews. So yeah, it's interesting. Although, I mean, I have it more for reference than because it's a good writing. It's not its overview. So anyway. Next is A History of the World by Hugh Thomas. I haven't gotten to this yet. I want to say I picked this up from the Friends of the Library book sale 7-8 years ago. So not much to say about it. This is A History of the World with the Women Put Back In by Kirsten Luker and Uda Dinshow. Translated by Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp and Jessica West. This is a basically a book that looks at how putting like women's roles in history. It's not so much the history of discovering women's roles in history and putting women back in history. It's more of an overview of women in history. I first discovered this, or first learned about this book from, I think, Jean's Bookish Thoughts. And I picked it up from Book Depository, and I didn't particularly care for it. I probably should have another go at it, but yeah. This is Ancient Civilizations by Christopher Scare and Brian M. Fagan. I want to say this is more of a textbook than anything else. I think I picked this up from Brazos Books, a used bookstore in Waco. Not Golden's Book Exchange, my favorite used bookstore in Waco, but another one. Although Brazos Books is quite nice. It's been forever since I've been there, though. I think they have new ownership now. Now, this is A History of the Ancient World by Chester G. Starr. I want to say I picked this up from the Friends of the Library book sale ages ago. I'm pretty sure that's where I picked this up. Haven't gotten around to it yet, though. And next is a book we've seen a few weeks ago. This is The Habsburgs by Martin Reidy. This is a history of the Habsburg dynasty from their beginnings in Switzerland to the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire and the removal of the Habsburg dynasty from the thrones of Austria and Hungary. It's quite good. I really enjoyed it. Next is one of my Alexander the Great biographies. There will be quite a bit of Alexander on this show. There is quite a bit of, there are a number of Alexander biographies on this shelf. First up is Soldier, Priest, and God, A Life of Alexander the Great by F.S. Knighton. This is a really good biography that looks at Alexander through the context of his religion, and it's very fascinating. Um, and it's a look that one very rarely, I think, gets of Alexander. Next is another Alexander the Great biography. This is Alexander the Great, His Life and His Mysterious Death by Anthony Everett. This is a really good biography as well. Um, Came out, I think, the year after Soldier, Priest, and God. And then I got to them a year after they were published. So yeah, this is really good too. I particularly liked Everett's arguments over what exactly killed Alexander, which I think was some kind of disease. That was a recurrence of one he had very early on in his campaigns. Next is uh, another book on the Macedonians. This is by the Spear, Philip II, Alexander the Great, and the Rise and Fall of the Macedonian Empire by Ian Worthington. And this is a pretty good overview of the Macedonian Empire, and it really does give a lot of attention to Philip II. Next is Antony and Cleopatra by Adrian Goldsworthy. I need to get to this. I've read some of his other work, his Punic Wars. Obviously read late last year his Philip and Alexander, and I think I've read The Fall of Rome too, but I need to get to this. And then we have From Alexander to Cleopatra by Michael Grant, which I think I picked up from Bryce's books as well, but haven't gotten to yet. I really need to. And this is Dividing the Spoils, The War for Alexander the Great's Empire by Robin Waterfield. This is a history of the wars of the successors. Basically, after Alexander's death, a number of his generals basically took over basically divided the empire into a number of satrapies. Putatively under regent for Alexander the Fourth, Alexander's son by Roxanne, and Alexander's young older brother who had developmental issues. But gradually, these governors or satraps began to war among themselves to either become regent themselves or to basically become emperor or king of kings. And so these wars lasted for decades until basically Alexander's empire was three large states: the Antigonid Kingdom, which was mostly Macedonian Greece, the Seleucid Empire, which was most of the Middle East, and then the Ptolemaic Egypt, which was Egypt. And then there were a few states in Anatolia that managed to remain independent, like Pergamum, Pontus, Bithynia. Anyway, next is The Greeks and Persians by Herman Bingston. I'm thinking I picked this up from the Friends at the Library book sale a number of years ago. Might have been the last time I went. Next is Great State, China and the World by Timothy Brooke. This is a history of China's interactions with the world from the Yuan dynasty through to the current communist dynasty. which is really good. This is a very fascinating book. I quite enjoyed it. Next is Age of Conquest, The Greek World from Alexander to Hadrian by Angelos Cheniatis. This is a really interesting look at the Hellenistic world from Alexander through to, I want to say, Hadrian. Obviously, it does say that. It's really fascinating. I think the book's better during the Hellenistic period proper, when the successor states to Alexander's empire were extant, rather than once Rome has gobbled them all up. Because at that point, it gets a little bit, not necessarily, the details go in a different direction, or the focus goes in a different direction that I'm not as fond of. But it is, again, a really good book. Next is Technology in the Ancient World by Henry Hodges. I've had this book for ages. I first read it, I think I interlibrary loaned it, because I'm interested in the ancient world, and I thought having a book that looked at technology in the ancient world would be helpful for world building if I ever wanted to create a fantasy world inspired by the ancient world and have a bit more of a foundation of what I'm talking about. And this is a pretty fascinating book. Again, focuses primarily on Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Mediterranean, and not so much China and India, which is a bit disappointing. But for what it is quite fascinating. And finally, for this shelf, this is Carthage by David Soren, Aisha Ben Abed Ben Kadir, and Heidi Slim. This is a look at Carthage from its foundations to the Roman colony. Basically, after the Punic Wars, Rome physically destroyed Phoenician Carthage. Of course, using Phoenician as under advisement. Of course, since I read the In Search of the Phoenicians, whether or not Phoenician is really a useful term for the people we call Phoenicians, but for lack of a better term, this Phoenician Carthage was physically destroyed after the Third Punic War, but about a decade or maybe a century or so later, the Romans refounded Carthage as a Roman colony, which has pretty much evolved into modern Tunis, or near enough. So anyway, that's a pretty interesting book. I read it a few years ago, a bit technical. So yeah, that was part one of my history shelves. I will move on to part 2 tomorrow, and then start back up next week with the rest of it. The history shelves will take about 2 weeks or so, and then we'll get to the rest of the book. And then we'll be on to science fiction and fantasy, which is going to take forever. I did say science fiction and fantasy was the largest part of my collection, and it is. Even if history is rapidly expanding, it's still not nearly as big as my science fiction and fantasy collections. But anyway, for now, I'm talking about history, so anyway. So I'll be back tomorrow with part 13 and history 2 of my library tour. And of course, there'll be weekly reads in the evening. So until then, BookTube, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.